Hello and most welcome to 833. There is a rather chilly afternoon here. We had some wind before, but it's sealed itself. I would today like to talk about space, so appropriately I put myself into space. This is a very spacious environment. And everything is nicely white painted. Goes for a very pleasant opening, and by acknowledging the space we have around us, we can actually become more present in our minds and bodies. I would today talk about something that's been on my mind for quite some time, I'd say, and never got any complete clearance about it. It's a difficult subject, and it has to do with depth of perception or experience. If you read a book, which I can highly recommend, The Matter with Things by Ian McGilchrist, and already in his earlier book, The Master and His Emissary. One typical aspect that Ian McGilchrist notes in patients that lacks or have insufficient right cerebral cortex, or the right brain hemisphere, that they lack a sense of depth. That is interesting, but it's hard to put into a living, actual reality, I thought. And it is a tough nut to crack. It is not something you can only understand in the regular manner. You need actually to be more present to understand it. Otherwise, it doesn't make so much sense. Otherwise, it would be just that you acknowledge, yes, the patients suffering from lack of right hemisphere don't know depth, and their paintings, drawings lack the third view. Depth is incredibly important in experience, and it is important here not to confuse the depth that we are accustomed to when we do calculations or measure things like this very room here. Here it would be measured in the dimensions x, y, z. And that should not be confused with depth proper, which is actually something completely different, although they share similarity. The real depth of reality is not a perpendicular third axle in the XYZ system. The real depth is an experience depth. Space is not just three perpendicular arrows that stretches into the universe from some origo. Real depth is an experience depth. Think about it this way. The coordinate system is only actually possible in a completely homogeneous space. And since we know that space is not homogeneous, it is not sufficient to say that x, y, z will be depth. That is actually depth on 2 dimensions, or most at the time it's actually depth on a 2-dimensional flat paper, or a computer screen for all that matter. And even when you think about it, I noticed when I myself ponder about the subject that I actually think about depth in that way. There are 2 things to sort of think about here. One thing is that that sort of depth is rather new. It is stemming from geometry and the development of geometry, but it is hardly something that has always been with us. So depth obviously existed before we made the 3rd axle, the z-axle. Real depth is something completely different, while rather one could say that real depth is something more encompassing. It is the depth of reality itself, and it can actually be checked. How good are you at sort of evaluating distance? This is truly related to really understanding space. And since it used to be my profession to value distance, to see how many yards, meters, whatever it was, I realized the more I think in the XYZ, the less accurate are my perceptions. I could use a machine, and often use one, laser measurer. That one is actually using the Cartesian coordinate system. But it doesn't mean that space actually is constructed that way. Do not confuse reality with a helping tool. You can have both, but they should not be confused, because actually being alive in space with your whole body is something that is happening with your body already in space. And that is something that struck me the other day, as late as yesterday I would say. That is something that is completely different. And all of a sudden space is not homogeneous. For instance, if I would use the laser measurer here inside the room, it wouldn't work because there are too many reflective surfaces. There is nothing wrong with using a model, but there is a problem when the models seem to limit the scope of what you can perceive. Then it becomes problematic. And you are always already situated in space. Do not take the perceiving agent, the observer, out of the equation. Something I learned from quantum mechanics. We should not do it in our regular life as well. And when I think about space in the XYZ, I try to get out of my own situation. And it's quite extraordinarily different to be in this very moment. It is not the same thing. That I'm speaking about now is a felt experienced location. And this is what we need for following things, and this is the second. We need to be located in our own space in order to be able to move around. And the degree of awareness of space, the depth of space, is directly affecting of how good your balance is. because we already are situated with balancing system, the gimbal, as I mentioned the other day, and I was still in warm water and not freezing as much as I am now. But we need to put my jacket shut. That action space is a necessity for you to balance. Secondly, your balancing system is directly the same thing as your thinking system. It's the idea of internality and externality. What is external, what is internal, that gets confused here. There is not always a difference there. We use exactly the same depth measurement when we are thinking. And here, the third point coming from Ian McGilchrist, people who lack a sense of depth cannot think effectively. The mind space is completely related to the balancing function of the body/mind system. So what we usually part when we think that we are situated in an XYZ diagram is the body itself. That is the component that's lacking. And instead we put the proxy of the origo there. That's about what we do. But taking in space that we've been trying to do for some while is now accelerating. It is much easier now, much easier. Since I realized being in space is the prerequisite for thinking clearly as well. Not only being balanced, which is not an only either, but it could be in some aspects something that you see or look upon as being rather limited and not that important. It is very important because you live in the world. Well, how about the Cartesian model or whatever coordinate system you are using? Well, go ahead and use it. It's just those times when there is a limitation coming up for no good reason, when there is a transference from the model to real life, and that makes you mind-wandering and losing your grip on where you are, and all of a sudden stress erupts. You are not located, the body goes into stress mode, and your brain shuts down. This is happening so instantaneously, so it's very hard to notice the difference between what is taking place within yourself and what at the same time is taking place outside yourself. But with a little bit of training, you will start to notice that there is an automatic change when you are no longer present in this location where you actually are, and when you are having access to space, this vaster, bigger space. It's a huge difference, I would say. Another way, fourth way of looking at the whole thing is what we mentioned so many times about fractality, fractals. There are no straight lines in reality. They are in itself something of a blockage for knowledge. The idea of the straight line is an impossibility, even inside the mind. We can still use straight lines as thinking to, but don't think about them as replacement for reality. I think that is where the problem starts to erupt. I asked someone the other day about space and dimensionality. I think that helped actually. And the response came directly, well, we are all situated in a three-dimensional world. And all of a sudden I got that sense of that person had replaced the helping tool with a more larger reality, a reality where he was actually situated. And that leads to direct failure of balance and a sort of shallowness to experience. And we get this friction I often mention when we're not paying attention, when we lose our backs and we lose what's above us. Going back to that, we become more present, we are relaxing, that is happening at the same time, and you get a sense of actually standing on something. You are all of a sudden on a stable grounding. And I presently start to wiggle back and forth. I am still wiggling a little bit, but the more you take in space, the more the system can balance itself up. This is partly different from being in the coordinate system. It's not the same thing. One could say and this is a fifth aspect, one could say that the truer dimensionality is before, in a way. Obviously, historically, we did not use the coordinate system before the Romans or Greek, or well, it goes all the way back to the Egyptians. It's hard to say that it was firmly established in the general thinking by then. But today it is general, so it's historically an antecedent. But it's also something that is more true to direct reality. The Cartesian coordinates are always and have to be something derived from a more encompassive and comprehensive space. And of course, in this more comprehensive and encompassing space, we are also able to mind-wise do a lot more things, because XYZ is limiting in thinking. How you sequence things tends to posits, chiasmas, or clefts, distances, and these distances seem to become harder the more established, so to speak, they become. So it's a broadening, it's easing up, and it's an easing up upwards, going above and further up than we are used to. And here we are more getting into the pulse of reality itself. Just gonna return to my notes. One sense that is very clearly closely connected to this limitation of the three perpendicular axes is that it limits in thinking how you can sequence things. There are only one sequencing allowed, one moment passing after another, and nothing in between, and you cannot put anything in between two moments. That's not allowed. Neither can you reverse the sequencing. And that shows that the three-dimensionality, the more shallow picture, you can call that space one, is also having its limiting effects on time. Because we take our models from space when we use time. There is a relationship, you could say they are brethrens. And that causes a sort of a limitation also in time. It's here where we see the absolute limitation of the system when it comes into time. It's just one straight line, it's lacking substance, broadness, and for each and every instance there can only be one happening and nothing more. And they go together to sort of lock the whole idea of reality, that I am situated in this three-axis system and time is passing on a linear scale. And I can confirm that by seeing it was a movement before, and after that will another movement turn up. That's nothing wrong with that in itself, but it is definitely a really limiting view of the whole thing, and it goes for tension in the body. The body is becoming tense from it. It does not feel itself to be in the proper reality and the flow of time. In the proper flow of time, you are participating, you are there with your observation, and also very much so with your intention. let's see here. Well, time in itself is more of a depth situation where you can have a movement underneath another movement. You see, when the line is established, when we were speaking about Julian Barber, we often talked about the washing line. And that line is the thing that connects different movements with each other in a long, well, linear time, sequential long order, where every moment in time is preceded by another one. And this is, of course, what also builds up cause and effect in the Newtonian system. But think that it is most definitely necessary that there is also a before here. Before these things were firmly established, there must have been something that was before. Some medium, some space where this was established. And just thinking about the before is also something that gives you a pointer to before the establishment in this present moment. There must have been a greater openness present for that to evolve. I don't know if I'm making myself clear here, but in order, well, let me give you an example there. Check out logic and what we discovered with Graham Priest. And what he discovered is that there is a before the excluded middle. So before we said that space is this way with the antagonistic two things, true for false, for instance, and that came to a limitation where only one thing in the end was allowed, so to speak. It's not a rule, it's not a law, but it is how the model is situated that leads to this result. Sorry about the darkness. Well, I continue in darkness seem to be a power cut. Well, why not? We have to open up for what time presents. It's unusual things that sometimes. Logic is something that takes its starts from space, and the force of logic to show what it does show, to be effective, is taking everything from space. Think about a black and white canvas. One thing is true, the other one is untrue. It is the division that is made possible by space and the properties of space that establish logic. And what does that mean? Your Graham Priest writes that means that we can actually go back to the before. And we can see that both things, both not exist and exist, for instance, or true and false can exist at the very same time. Why is that? Well, the reason is because they are stemming from the same space. They are coming from space and they will return to space. And it's in this space the possibilities are, and the force to say things, to make analysis, prognostic syllogism, the Aristotelian logic, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that it's coming from a greater openness. And the same, of course, goes for time. Time itself is felt to be limited these days. Many people object and feel that time is limited and that we can only relax when there is plentiful of linear time. I think that was mentioned in one of the podcasts we made together with Magical Thinking. And one said that I can only relax when there is plenty of time. Relaxation is not possible when I'm standing in the traffic line, going into the city or something similar. I mean, that reinforces the idea of limitation, makes the limitation even more certain. But time doesn't have this inherent limitation. Movements can be placed next to each other. And that is, of course, made overwhelmingly clear by the discoveries in quantum mechanics, where literally two things can be situated in the very same place, and that space do have these properties. And if space have these properties, that will also mean that time has these properties. That two movements can actually be at the very same time. And the normal exclusiveness that we are talking about, where one movement is the only thing that can be present in one instant, sort of softens. And all of a sudden, if you are stressed, you will see that you can acquire more space, and thereby you also will acquire more time. And you will also, hopefully, in the end, while practicing this for a time, notice this is how it's been going on all the time. No pun intended. But all the time you have felt that there is flexibility, and sometimes when you should have been stressed, you actually feel that you have plentiful of time. And the very idea of making time to exist could be something that is in itself partly stressful. And here we see a limitation that the ordinary coordinate system actually makes, and that is the unknowability of future. The experience of the future is axiomatically indeterminate. Something I took from the book by Tartantoku, Knowledge of Time and Space. So, location, conditions and consequences are completely and axiomatically indeterminate. And if you look from the present, where you are at now, we can speak of expectations, or we can identify a thrust toward becoming, as in a pregnancy approaching its term. But if you try to reverse this temporal flow, there is no possibility for communication. So the future as a projected projector of the present cannot be established in advance as valid in its specifics. If it were otherwise, the future would no longer be the future. Untouchable in its actuality, the future awaits present determination. And you see, this is so obviously coming from the present model. And by looking more sharply into the model and see if it can be eased up, expanded, more space can definitely be achieved. There will be an opening to more space. We will have the possibility of space being more present, more accessible. And not as shut out, and it eases up these sure barriers between the present and the future, something we discussed earlier in the idea of this very, very sharp dividing line between present, future and past, where present is the only place where things, so to speak, can exist. I would say that in itself is something that gives a sensation of crowdedness and lack of both space and time. And this is, of course, one of the reasons that by taking in more space, as I do now, I can sort of sigh, and I get more air and I become more present, and there is also a change in voice. The voice becomes more present, and it does no longer feel as the present is the only thing that exists. And those things are very much connected. The idea of existence as an essence, and that idea that essence can only be perceived in a now goes for an incredible amount of limitation. And it is literally flattening out reality, makes it more flat, and we become flatlanders in one aspect. And this is very similar when we looked at flatland life, where things are not as possible as they are for us living in a more depth situation. They cannot touch their own noses, the flatlanders, except in the little booklet of Allan Emreen. And you can imagine how their time could be very, very limited from our perspective. But also our regular perspective is in itself a limitation of something that is much broader, more encompassing, and you get there also partly by understanding it, as I'm trying to convey here now, but also by directly experiencing it, being in that situation and having the actual feel for it, that can only be done when you are present. Nobody else, not in the model only, but really present. And I would say that is the true meaning of depth. It's a more encompassing, and it does not exclude the coordinate system. That could actually exist side by side. You don't choose in between them because you don't have to. And this is this choicelessness that we experience on a daily basis that was expressed in this podcast. It's either or. Either I have an unlimited source of time and space, or I don't, because in the schedule I'm thinking in the planning I'm thinking in, that is shut out automatically. But look, the model can be expanded in itself. Not only time and space can be expanded, but also the knowledge, the model can be shown to be more encompassing, broader, and more forgiving, so to speak, more flexible. And you can start feeling this expansion of time not being a resource that is limited like the oil from the Middle East, which is so widely discussed these days of uncertainty. Well, I think this is a good time to round about this rather interesting subject. And of course, do not forget, this is once more the Klein bottle, where inside and outside always are conjoined, whereas they are completely separated also. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.